welcome everyone for joining this session of Econ UK webinar. The announcement is that our three-person team so far, Arianna Ornaghi, Francesco Giovagnoni, and me, is now joined by the fourth member in the organizing committee, Valeria Rueda from University of Nottingham. Welcome, Valeria, and you'll see more of her co-organizing later. Now, let's move to today's talk. Today we have Stephane Wolton from LSE. He's going to talk about a political economy of social discrimination. This is a joint work with Torun Dewan. In 2 weeks, we will have Belinda Archibong from Bernard College, Columbia University. And as usual, you can see more information about Polycon UK webinars on our website and by following us on Twitter. The format is as follows. We have a 50-minute presentation, which is followed by a 10-minute general discussion and questions. We request all attendees to keep your microphones muted, but if you have a clarifying questions, please unmute yourself and ask. Or you can register more substantive questions in the chat. We'll come back to them during the Q&A sessions at the end, where the questions are going to be live. After the Q&A, that is at the top of the hour, we'll finish the official part of the seminar and we will stop the recording. But please, you are all welcome to stay and chat informally. Stephane, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the organizing committee for having me and organizing this, what I can see is a very successful and exciting workshop. So thank you very much for the public good you're providing in these COVID times. So it's a paper joint with Torun Dewan about a political economy of social discrimination. So what is discrimination? I think that it's not always the case that I say this, but I would say that economists have come up with an excellent definition of what discrimination is. It means that two individuals with similar economic characteristics experience unequal economic, social, or political outcomes as a result of one's individual non-relevant or non-economic factors such as race or sex. Okay, so what happened in this case is that the evaluation of an individual is not based on what it can bring to the firm, what it can bring to the society, but where it comes from. So this is an excellent definition because it frames the problem extremely well, I find. But, it's something that is missing just one element to it. So let me give you another definition that I think complements it quite well. It's a definition that comes from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's a bit complicated. It's about this is a discrimination, consists of action, practice, or policies that are based on perceived social groups to which those discriminated against belong, and the part that is important and has been enlightened, that the relevant group must be socially salient in that they structure interaction in important social contexts. And so what is interesting about this particular definition is that it reminds us that it is important that the trait on which people discriminate is salient. And that discrimination, as Allport expressed it multiple times in his famous book on prejudice, discrimination is always a social phenomenon. And at the same time, when we start of thinking about discrimination this way, this opens the possibility for discrimination to be sustained by norms, okay, to be sustained by social norms of interaction. So here is an example, a bit long, sorry, I will try to summarize, of the cargo in the southwest of France. So who are the cargo? The cargo were just people that look very much like the normal inhabitants of this part of France. All right? But the cargo were severely discriminated against. They could not take certain jobs. They could not enter the church by the main door. Okay? They were basically relegated on the outside of society. And why were they relegated on the outside of society? To these days, nobody knows exactly why. It was just sustained by norms that if you were to interact directly or indirectly with a cargo, you will be ostracized by the rest of the community. Okay, so this was a strong form of discrimination that lasted for centuries, that was based on nothing, or at least nothing tangential that historians have found, but social norms of interactions. Here is another kind of like, example closer to our time of social discrimination at play. This is the discrimination of African American in the South of the United States. And this is coming from Alport's book. And, I'm going to be apologizing for the terms that I'm going to use in the next seconds. But I think that, this is coming from the quote directly. So let me just say it. So Alport reports that friendly social interactions with Negroes in some region of the United States bring accusation of communism and are likely to lead to social ostracism, which is to say that part of the discrimination suffered by African Americans was due to social norms. It was not just due to statistical belief-based discrimination or taste-based. There was an element of it that was social norms. So another example is, of course, the case of India that is still present strongly today. Castes are a form of social discrimination, as Akerlof in his seminal 1976 paper tell us, which is the fear of ostracisms kind of like sustain the caste system as much as the religious belief of a better life in the future. Okay, so this is to give you a few examples of kind of like norms sustaining discrimination. But if we think about norms, if we think about what happened with the cargo, if we think what happened in other case with the Irishmen in the United States, comparing what happened in the 19th century with what is happening today, with the Italians in France that were severely discriminated in the 19th century and are kind of like completely integrated now, what we can see is that norms, who are the out group, to use the language of social psychology, change over time. Okay, so this notion of norm-based discrimination kind of like change over time. And so a question that we can ask ourselves as well is, how can norm change to kickstart this norm-based discrimination? Or is it that we kind of like move from a world that there might be some demand for this form of discrimination to the realization of this form of discrimination? So it is basically the idea. This is how do we go from the demand for new norms to norm-based discrimination, to this idea that you do not interact with someone, not because you statistically discriminate, not because you have a prejudice, a taste-based discrimination against this person, but because you fear of social ostracism if you start discriminating this way. And what we suggest is that in this paper as well, is that the link between these two is going to be symbolic policies. Symbolic policies are going to channel the demand for new discriminatory norms into practice, okay? And we will see what become clearer when I go through the model, that is a device for equilibrium selection. So what are symbolic policies? Here are an example of some of them. On the top left corner, this is Danish, this is on the day the Danish parliament passed a law, anti-burqa law in the public sphere, or anti-veil law in the public sphere, and there were a demonstration. And while, the person is hugging a policeman, what happened is that if you look closely and you zoom in, this person is actually crying, and the policeman was there to comfort her. In the middle is, in some sense, a policy that inspired this paper. This is the burkini ban in France in the summer of 2018, I think. And this is the idea that on the public beach of certain French municipalities, it was forbidden for women to come with a burkini, which is a swimming suit covering the hair of the woman. And these are two municipal policemen asking a woman to remove a burkini. And on the bottom right, to show you that this is kind of like a general type of policy, this is the Prime Minister of Bavaria imposing that any public building in Bavaria would have a Christian cross in them, just to remind everybody who was the in-group and who is the out-group. So how can norm change to kickstart norm-based discrimination via, for example, the implementation of symbolic policies? And what we will see is that these symbolic policies, this kickstarting of norm-based discrimination will have large repercussions for social interactions. Okay, so this is going to be basically the idea of this paper is to introduce you to the notion of social discrimination and to study why it arises and what are the consequences of social discrimination. So let me give you a few examples of kickstarting norm-based discrimination. This is again the same example as I gave you before. This is what happened in Denmark at the time when the anti-burqa ban, the burqa ban was passed by the Danish parliament. And this is a young woman from Agavang, which is a Muslim-dominated estate, a 30-year woman, and this is what she has to say about the consequences of the burqa ban. Do you know how many lawyers, doctors, and engineers have come out of these blocks? I see so many people studying, trying to become part of this country, but suddenly, we are not good enough because we don't eat pork. Okay, so this is not a matter that these people are kind of like have trouble assimilating. They are trying to assimilate it. They want to integrate the Danish economy. But it is the part that suddenly the norm have changed, and for some symbolic reason, they are not good enough anymore. Okay, so it's not driven by their lack of assimilation, it's driven by something else. Here's the case of Austria when the FPO was in power. I mean, it's still in power, but like when it comes back to power a few years ago. And this is Professor Mahmoud Yazud saying that before the FPO was in power, Muslims were interacting with the rest of the society, but not anymore. Now, neighbors who used to come to open days at the mosque do not come. Okay, so the Muslim is cast aside from the whole society. Again, nothing to do with kind of like, radical Islamism or this type of thing. And here is a case of India, where BJP state government has passed a beef ban. And this is what this butcher has to say about it. He said, everything this government has come in, I feel people look at me and see a Muslim for the first time. Okay, so this sentence is important because it tells us what? It tells us that this butcher was always a Muslim. Okay, it's not the case that suddenly this person converted and became a Muslim. No, what matters is the perspective that others had of this person. Prior to it, these people were seeing first and foremost a butcher who may or may not provide good meat for their family meal. But since the arrival of the BJP government, when they interact with this butcher, they do not see a butcher anymore. They see a Muslim first and foremost. They see the Muslim first and the butcher later. And we will see this coming back into the model that we're going to present. So what do we do in this paper? We study the possibility of discrimination sustained by norms, okay, which we are going to call social discrimination. We are going to show that social discrimination can arise despite no ex-ante differences in human capital. Okay. Let me be clear that there is a large literature, which I'm pretty sure some of the people in this call have contributed to, where non-relevant factor can serve as a focal point. Okay, so our contribution in some sense is not to kind of like create this sort of model. Okay, this model has been around in the literature, and as I said, since 1976 and Akerlof's seminal paper. Our contribution lies more in the following. What we do is that we are going to embed the possibility of social discrimination in a canonical labor market model. Canonical circa the time I was doing my economic PhD, okay? And this is going to allow us to study, I think for maybe one of the first time, the full economic and political consequences of social discrimination. We are going to be able to tell you the effect of unemployment. We are going to be able to tell you the impact of social discrimination on firm productivity and on the economy as a whole. And which, you know, I will not be able to tell you during this presentation, but I'm happy to discuss a little bit after. We are going to also discuss the consequences for redistribution, okay? And one thing that this particular approach allows us to do, which is something that the literature on discrimination may be missing or has not put a lot of emphasis on, is that we are also able to think about the causes of social discrimination. We're able to tell you why, and in some sense, when social discrimination is likely to arise. We're able to tell you under which condition there's going to be this demand for social discrimination that is going to transform into actual social discrimination. Okay, so this is going to be kind of like one of the aspects of the paper that is also novel. It's not just looking at the consequences, it's also looking at the causes. So given that we have only 50 minutes, I will skip this part. I just want to say one thing and repeat again. We are not the first to use identity as a focal point. I do not want you to go back from this talk saying, oh, they are claiming they are the first of doing this. We are not. We are building on an excellent and large literature on this. And in particular, we are building on an excellent paper by Peschke and Schwentes, published in the AR in 2013. Okay, so just to be clear about where we stand, our contribution is more on thinking about the consequences of unpacking the consequences and unpacking the causes when we embed social identity as focal point into a canonical labor market model. Okay, so that's where I think the contribution lies of the paper. So if there is no clarifying questions, I will move to the theoretical framework. I think there was a question in the chat, but I don't know if it was a pressing.
No, it was just an invitation for questions.
Okay.
No questions so far.
Very good. If there is any question, please do not hesitate to interrupt. I'm very happy to clarify anything.
Okay, sorry, can I register a question
Yes.
maybe for later? Maybe you'll have a chance to kind of interweave this. Going into applied issues, what is the way to test this versus other forms of you know, discrimination? So having that in mind.
Yeah, I can like I think it's I will discuss this at the end of probably of the presentation.
Yeah, thanks.
I think that's a very good point, and indeed it's a point that has been raised by reviewers. So let me show you the theoretical framework, and Max is asking an excellent question that I will come back to it, I think, toward the end of the 50 minutes. So the game has two candidates, A and B, a mass 1 plus F of citizens, which can be of two types, physical traits, we're going to call them. Either they have a majority trait or they have a minority trait. Okay, and I want you to think about trait in a kind of like, you know, wide sense. So obviously it can be physical feature, the color of the skin, or a certain aspect ratio. So obviously when we think about African American, the color of the skin is the first thing that comes. But when we think of Muslim in France, for example, we will see that like any French person will be able to identify most North African relative to a native French. We can also think about the first name that has been shown by Adida and co-author to matter for discrimination in the excellent book on discrimination in France. So the game is going to have two parts. One is going to be a political market that I'm going to describe, but I will not have the time to solve. I've never managed to present this part of the paper to any seminar. And the second part is the labor market that I hope to give you more flavor of as we move on in this presentation. So in the political market, we try to make it as simple as possible. What is going to happen is that the candidates there are two candidates, they are office motivated, and they are going to propose a platform. This platform contains two elements: a proportional tax on income that is uniformly redistributed across workers, which I will introduce to you, with some deadweight loss to avoid to have maximum taxation all the time, and a symbolic policy. Okay, which is going to play a role. Citizens are going to vote sincerely after observing the two candidates' platform, and we suppose when indifferent that they vote against the symbolic policy. Okay, it's just as a way to, basically the symbolic policy becomes an equilibrium selection device. Platforms are implemented after the election, but before we enter in the labor market. So the labor market is is going to be an infinitely repeated game with a mass one of workers and a mass one of employers. Of these employers, we think that a proportion F of them are citizens, and the rest of them represent public services or foreign firms. If there are pressing questions, I just see the chat popping, but if there are pressing questions, do not hesitate to interrupt me. Rather than the chat in case. We are going to assume that there is the following proportion of majority physical trait among workers and employers. Okay? Alpha W is going to be the proportion of workers that belong to the majority group. Alpha F is going to be the proportion of employers that belong to the majority group. Okay, we do not impose that alpha W and alpha F are equal. Indeed, in the full papers, it's very important that they are not. Okay, some of the results rely on the assumption that they are not equal. In what follow, the most important parameters to remember for the rest of the presentation are this alpha W and alpha F. Okay, so alpha W is the proportion of majority workers, or workers with majority physical trait. Alpha F is the proportion of majority employers or employers with majority social trait. These are really the two parameters with whom I'm going to play for the rest of the presentation.
So can I ask a question?
Yes, absolutely, Arda, thank you.
Even the employers who are like public service and foreign firms have a physical identity.
Yes. Right? So yeah, we assume that everybody has a form of physical identity, that the owner of the firm or the manager of the firm matter for these kind of things. Yes, the issue is the model gets quite complex quite fast, and we need a one-to-one mapping between the mass of workers and the mass of employers. Mm-hmm. So that was kind of like a way to do this.
Yeah.
What would have been nicer, but we never found a way to solve this in a way that was kind of making us happy, was to think that like firms could have more than one worker.
Yeah.
But then the problem is, could you get contagion across the firm, within the firm, or just between the owner and the workers? And if you think it's only between the owner and the workers, then everything goes through in our model. If you think it can become contagious within workers in the firm, then it becomes like extremely complicated to solve what is going on. Though I will conjecture, and conjecture is important for it, that the result all even in that setting. Okay, so it's a simplifying assumption.
Okay, thank you.
But all of them have the identity.
Mm-hmm.
So what happened on the labor market? Each firm has one position, which is either filled or open. Okay. And what happened is that each period, there's going to be a match between the unemployed worker and the employer with an open position. Okay, random matching, not directed. We can talk about what directed will do in this setting. I don't think it will change the result, but there is this kind of like matching going on among the pool of like open firms, of firm with open position, and the pool of unemployed workers. Okay, when they match, both need to agree to enter into a working relationship. If they do not agree, the position remains open and the workers remain unemployed. The working relationship is going to generate some level of production theta I. Theta I is match specific, and for simplicity, though it's not kind of like a critical assumption, it's really just to make our life easier, it's uniformly distributed over 0, 1. Of this match, the employer gets a profit theta I minus W. The worker gets a wage W. The wage is exogenous in the baseline model, but we have endogenized it and nothing changed. And what is important is that the working relationship is persistent with probability 1 minus delta. Okay, so you can be stuck with your match in sometimes. There is some friction in terms of hiring and firing. So in terms of utility, there is going to be some revenues that are going to be transformed into a transfer. Okay, this transfer is going to suffer from some deadweight loss of taxation, again, to avoid the tax rate being equal to 1. And then they are going to receive the following utility. The employer is going to get the net profit. Okay, so 1 minus tau, the tax rate, times theta minus W if the position is filled, 0 if the position is open. The worker is going to get the net wage if he's employed, plus a uniform transfer, or the worker is just getting the transfer if she's unemployed. And each period, the payoff are discounted with discount factor beta between 0 and 1. All right, so that's kind of like just a utility. To summarize the labor market timing, so let's start with the field position. First, the production is realized. Okay. After the production is realized, then the working relationship breaks down with exogenous probability delta. Okay. If the working relationship does not break down, so if it survives with probability 1 minus delta, we payoff are realized and we move on to the same period with the position still filled. If the position is open, there is first no production. A match occurs with the available workers, and the employer and the workers observe the match specific theta. The match employer and worker decide whether to enter into a working relationship. If they do, they move to the case where the position is filled. If they don't, the position remains open, and next period, we enter back with the open position. Payoff are realized, and we move to the next period. All right. The equilibrium concept is stationary subgame perfect Nash equilibrium, and we assume that the labor market immediately adjusts. Okay, so we are only looking at the labor market steady state in this game. So one thing I want to say about this labor market is that in this game, there are two sorts of labor market frictions. The first is that matches are sticky with probability 1 minus delta. So that's the first thing. The second one is more subtle, is that there is no production when the match is kind of like realized, when the employer and the employee decide to work together. Yet they have to wait 1 period before they start working together. Okay, so there are these two sort of friction in the model. Now, I'm going to make a confession to you. This is a bad modeling choice, but it's like a mistake. In fact, for all the result to hold, you only need one type of friction. Either the matches are sticky, or there is this delay in the production of the firm. Okay. If you have any of this friction, the model goes on. If you have neither of this friction, then the model collapses. Okay, I just want to be clear that you need the friction, but you just need one type of friction, not two.
Stephane?
Yes.
You said something about this, they decided whether to, go on with a match or not.
Yes.
Given your payoffs, I'm assuming that this is the firm's decision, I guess, but you didn't give any details about this.
So sorry, thank you. Very, very, very important point, Francesco. Thank you for clarifying. No, it is extremely important that both the firm and the worker agree to work together. And we will see why when we go. You're absolutely right. Your intuition is spot on, that when there is no possibility for social discrimination, only the firm is going to make a decision. That is, the firm is going to be the one deciding whether to hire or not. When there is the possibility for social discrimination, both the firm and the employer have to have this decision, this possibility to make this decision. And I think this will become clearer in a few slides when I expose to you the labor market equilibrium. But yeah, it's very important. There is this kind of like joint agreement. They both have to agree to work together.
Okay, so mechanically, game theoretically, basically what happens is they observe theta I, and
Yes.
then they both say yes or they're matched. If one of them says no, they're not. But you fix the W, so basically that's the only decision that needs to be made.
Yes. We have an extension where we endogenize the W through Nash bargaining.
Okay.
And I will show you, I don't know if there is time, I will show you what you lose a lot in terms of complexity. This is the longest appendix I've ever written. I don't recommend you read this part of the paper, but you gain a little bit, you gain one more thing that I will show you at the end of the presentation if there is time. But yeah, this is not but it's critical this is the one decision they are making, and it's critical they are both making it.
Okay.
Could I also ask a clarifying question, please?
Absolutely.
So I was wondering, this data, this random draw, is it idiosyncratic per period, and are you assuming IID, or are you allowing correlation across time?
That's an excellent question. So far, it's going to be match specific, so it's really going to be IID across matches. So once you're in a match, it's fixed. But once a match break, your next productivity does not depend on your past productivity. So within a firm, the productivity is fixed, but across firms, the productivity is IID, drawn from a uniform distribution.
All right, thank you.
I'm really wishing one day to write the paper where you have the workers have a type, but already I'm not even sure we'll be managing to. Thank you for this a very important clarifying question. So far, I've talked to you about identity, physical identity, but it seems to play no role. But obviously, it's on purpose that it plays no role so far. Okay. For example, the match productivity does not depend on the physical identity of the employer or the worker. Further, it's fully revealed at the time of the hiring decision. Therefore, in this setting, there is no room for statistical discrimination. Okay, it is not possible to have statistical discrimination in this setting. Right? In addition, the per period payoff on the labor market is completely independent of the identity of your worker or the identity of your employer. It just depends for the worker on the wage and for the employer on the productivity. Therefore, there is no room in this paper for taste-based discrimination. Now, I'm not saying any of these do not exist in real life. What we want to show you is that you can generate discrimination absent this sort of issues, absent this sort of bias within the labor market. Okay, so this is just to show you the additional effect of social discrimination, putting taste-based and statistical discrimination to zero. Okay, the only way discrimination can arise in this particular paper is through social interaction. It is through norms. So how are we doing this? Here we are borrowing from, this excellent paper I've mentioned, Peszki and Schwentes, 2013. We are going to suppose that each citizen's identity is a two-dimensional vector. Is physical identity, phi, that I've been talking about, M, which can be M if you're from the majority and M if you're from the minority, and the social identity S, that can be capital M for majority, small m for minority, and the empty set, okay? What we are going to assume is that absent the symbolic policy, identity is not socially salient. Remember the definition I gave you at the beginning of the presentation. For discrimination to arise, it has to be the case that identity is socially salient. The traits on which we discriminate become socially salient. And we're going to assume that absent the symbolic policy, they are not salient. Therefore, all workers, employers have the same social identity, the empty set. With the symbolic policy, the identity becomes socially salient, and workers, employers are going to be differentiated according to this social identity S. And what is very important is that the social identity is observed before entering in a working relationship. So before the two, the worker and the employer decide whether or not to agree to work together. Okay, so that's kind of like a critical part also of the model. So building on Peszki and Schwentes, we're going to also assume that social identity depends on social interaction. And we're going to assume that social identity can be contagious. Okay, if an employer let's say majority employer, social majority employer, interact with a social minority workers, there is a probability rho that this employer acquires the identity of the worker, becomes a social minority employer. On the other hand, for the worker, there's a probability gamma that the worker acquires the identity of the employer. That is, the worker becomes, who was social minority, now become a social majority. So there's this possibility of contagions, okay? And this is related to the idea, and here again, I apologize for using bad language, but this is the language that was in the literature. This is the idea of Jew lover and all this type of thing, all right? And indeed, what we can see is that, like, ideally, and this is a bit of an exaggeration, and you will see why, we can define 4 groups. The first group is the pure majority, which has both physical and social majority traits. The second group is the tainted majority. These are the people that receive the bad names. Who have physical trait, but minority social trait. Okay, they are M, capital M, small m. Then we have the assimilated minority. That's the reverse. They have a minority social trait, a minority physical trait, but a majority social trait, capital M. And then we have the excluded minority, which are MM, okay, which are kind of both minority on physical and on social identities. So let me say that this is the realm of possibilities. In equilibrium in this particular setting, we are going to see that there's going to be only the two extremes of a pure majority and an excluded minority when we go to the labor market. So either any or clarifying questions on the setup before I briefly talk about the labor market analysis? No, very good. So let me give you the basic intuition in 10 minutes for the labor market analysis and a bit of the result. So let's suppose that there is no socially salient identity. Then in this case, everybody is identical. And as Francesco was kind of like guessing, it's only the firm that is going to have decision power when it comes to hiring. So the firm is going to hire a worker if the worker is sufficiently productive in the match specific productivity. if this is above a threshold theta ND. These thresholds, very importantly, satisfy theta ND as to be strictly greater than W, okay, strictly greater than the exogenous wage. Why is it to be strictly greater? Well, because any employer faces a trade-off. On the one hand, if I hire a worker today, I'm making a profit today. But because matches are sticky, I lose the opportunity to find a better match tomorrow. Okay, and so there is basically this trade-off between, do I want to make a profit today but lose the opportunity to find a better match tomorrow, or do I want to find a better match tomorrow and lose the profit today? And theta ND, which is the productivity of the current match, is the one that equalizes the two. And so above theta ND, the profit today is higher than the opportunity costs. So that's basically the logic for this type of model. But because there is kind of like a difference between the hiring threshold and the wage, this can create the opportunity for social discrimination to be favorable to one part of the population. So what happened in a world with socially salient identity? Now, first of all, let me say that there is always an equilibrium where there is no discrimination, but we have excluded this equilibrium in terms of like making the, in some sense, the symbolic policy, making a selection to the equilibrium that is inducing social discrimination, okay? So the symbolic policy, the way we have set it up, create an equilibrium selection, become the sunspot through which everybody coordinates on the discriminatory best responses, okay? So what happened in this equilibrium with discrimination in the labor market? Well, there's gonna be a fully segregated labor market. Worker with majority social identity only agrees to work with employer with majority social identity. Okay. Employer with majority social identity never hires workers with minority social identity. So what happens is that you have a market for the majority and a labor market for the minority. The majority workers and employers work together. The minority workers and employers work together, but there is never crossing between the two. Okay. So what does it mean? It means that most jobs are close to minority workers. So what do we need to sustain this equilibrium? The first thing we need to sustain this, let me say first that like the equilibrium has a similar feature, but now we have two hiring thresholds, one for the majority and one for the minority. And what matters, but for the political part, is that both type of firms, the majority and the minority, become more lenient. They're more likely to hire. Why are they more likely to hire? Well, let's think about the trade-off that an employer was facing. The trade-off was between profit today and the opportunity cost of not matching with a better match tomorrow. But with social discrimination, a majority employer is less likely to find a better match tomorrow. Indeed, each time the majority employer finds his match with a minority worker, the majority employer has to say, no, I cannot hire you. Therefore, the opportunity cost of hiring decreases, which means that you kind of consider a lower profit to start hiring the worker. Okay, so that's the reason the firm become more lenient. And that's kind of like what plays a big role in the political analysis. But let me tell you, what do we need to sustain this equilibrium? One, it has to be, as I just said, that the majority employer doesn't want to work with a minority worker, even if this worker happens to be the best productive worker ever. Okay. Why would the majority employer not want to work with this worker? Well, this majority employer must fear the cost of becoming tainted, must fear the ostracism that will come if this majority employer is contaminated and become a social minority employer. Okay. So there needs to be kind of like a fear of ostracism, the fear of losing the possibility to work with majority workers in the future. When is this fear kind of like realized? When is this fear potent? Well, it is potent when it's harder to hire a minority than majority workers, when it's much harder to find a minority workers than a majority workers, okay? And for this to happen, it has to be that the proportion of majority workers has to be sufficiently high, okay? Because basically you have to lose a big pool of worker for you to fear this kind of like this ostracism, to have the fear of ostracism and the fear of becoming a social minority yourself, okay? So the pool of majority worker has to be big enough, which is alpha W has to be bigger than a threshold. The second condition is that the majority worker has to refuse to work for minority firm, okay? This majority worker can be matched randomly with a minority firm, and the worker say, no, I don't want to work with you. It doesn't matter what you do to me, I do not want to work with you, okay? And for this to happen, it's the same phenomenon. It has to be that I, as a majority worker, feel the ostracism that will come if I become contaminated. That is that I fear that will not be ever again in the future to work with majority employers, okay? And for this to happen, it has to be that the proportion of majority worker has to be sufficiently low. Why the proportion of majority worker has to be sufficiently low? Well, think about it. Alpha W is the set of your competitors if you are a majority worker. 1 minus alpha W, the remaining, is the set of your competitors if you are a minority worker. If there are a big number of alpha W, okay, if there's a large competitors in the merger, then becoming a minority worker is not so bad after all, because you face less competition for the minority firm than you face competition for the majority firm. But if there is not such a big set number of workers to compete with, then in this case you will kind of like prefer to remain a majority worker. So it's kind of like this alpha W measure how much competition you face as a majority worker relative to a minority worker, and this competition cannot be too high. Okay, so that's basically the equilibrium condition, and this is kind of like what it looks like graphically. Let me say that like we proved formally that the two thresholds are strictly lower than one each other, and so there is always this possibility for the con to exist. Let me also say that the full proposition, the existence also depend on the discount factor being sufficiently large, so that the cost of ostracism in the future has to weigh sufficiently in the decision of the employer and of the worker. So that's like the third element of it.
Stefan, we would have about 5 minutes.
Yes, so that's perfect. I will now I gave you a bit of an intuition for what is going on. Let me tell you about the consequences, and going back to your question marks. Labor discrimination is possible only if being hired is easier for the majority. Okay, that's kind of like what we discussed. If your competition as a majority worker is lower than your competition if you were a minority worker for a job, and if it's easier to hire if you're a majority firm than if you're a minority firm. What does it mean? That means that compared to majority workers, minority workers face higher unemployment rate and longer unemployment span. Compared to majority-owned firms, minority-owned firms have lower productivity. And therefore, social discrimination is going to induce large observable differences, despite the fact that all workers and all employers were exactly the same ex ante. Okay, so you do not need difference ex ante to generate difference ex post. This difference can be large. And here, I think that like it's a good point to come back to Mark's question. How does this comparative study, how does these predictions compared to, for example, test-based discrimination and statistical discrimination. So if there is, for example, a form of statistical discrimination that we observe is statistical discrimination against a minority. But in this case, if there is only statistical discrimination against minority workers, we will observe the higher unemployment rate for minority workers, but we will not observe the difference in productivity for the majority and the minority-owned firms. If you want to recover this type of patterns with statistical discrimination, you need to assume that majority-owned firms statistically discriminate against minority workers, and minority-owned firms, the minority employers, statistically discriminate against the majority workers. You need to have this kind of like cross discrimination, statistical discrimination, to recover the exact same pattern. Okay, and usually this is not what the way discrimination is conceived. Also, in terms of statistical discrimination, be technical, but like, usually it's based on the idea of your belief. Here, if the belief is correct, it cannot be the case that you recover this type of patterns. Now, there are other forms of statistical discrimination based on the noise, another thing where you could recover this type of thing, but if it's about belief about average productivity of the group, and the belief is correct, you will not be able to recover this type of patterns. What about test-based discrimination? Well, to have the same type of patterns with test-based discrimination, okay, you will need to have both employers and workers having animus against the minority. It's both at the level of the employers and at the level of the workers. Okay, so we can recover it, but you have to have like a full part of the population having kind of animus against the minority. And let me say one thing and one last thing, and I will finish on this. There is a take on test-based discrimination, which is Baker's take on it. And Baker's argument is to say, you know what, test-based discrimination, we don't have to worry too much about it, because the firms that engage in test-based discrimination will be less profitable than the firm that engage in non-test-based discrimination. And therefore, you will not kind of like, over time, this should disappear. In our world, that's not, you cannot have this positive aspect. In our world, if you think about entry of firms in the labor market, given that the majority-owned firms are the ones that are more making a bigger profit, the amount of new employers in some sense will mostly come from the majority group. And as you increase the number of majority group, in general, but not always, you will make social discrimination easier rather than harder to sustain. So contra Baker, when it comes to social discrimination, you get that you do not get a positive take. You do not get the idea that it will disappear over time. So I'm going to stop here. I'm sorry I cannot talk about the political aspect of it, but I'm very happy to discuss it maybe informally or in the Q&A session.
All right, thank you very much. Very exciting. So why don't we move to the Q&A session, the official part of the Q&A session. There was an early comment by Arthur Silva. Arthur, can you unmute yourself and report the question?
Yes, I can, but I cannot guarantee that it's going to be all quietly. Hi, Stephane.
Hi.
It was
I
very
see
nice
you. I
listening to
have a guest in some sense.
Yeah,
Oh.
This is the youngest member of your audience, probably.
This was to get him to sleep, to get her to get him to sleep.
Anyway, very interesting talk, and I hope that I got everything out of it despite the disturbances. I was wondering to which extent your model was also adapted to speak about systemic discrimination. We are speaking a lot, at least in Canada, about the concept of systemic discrimination, and I think that yours speaks to that too, except that maybe systemic discrimination does not entail necessarily some kind of intentionality by the majority group. And I was wondering whether your framework might also be able to address non-intentionality.
So this is, I mean, let me say, I will thank you very much, Arthur. Let me say that I will tell you a conjecture that I have, and I want to stress, like, in terms of substantive interpretation. I think from what I could read from the literature is like, it seems that a lot of discrimination that was test-based in the past kind of like has been kind of like going away. But what our papers show is that even if test-based discrimination disappears, you can still remain in the equilibrium that is discriminatory because the institution happened to benefit the majority group. They were instituted for other reasons, but today they happen to favor the majority group. And in this sense, I think this is where the paper talk about this aspect of systemic discrimination. Not all of it, but one part of the systemic discrimination.
Okay, great.
So thank you. I just quickly follow up on that. I had read in the past a long time ago, so I'm not going to do it justice, the paper by Peschke and Gentes, and I think that is very interesting. But I think that the equilibria they find depend on very, very stringent assumptions, and I think that your model is a lot simpler at the moment than what they present as the stable equilibria, only present in their attached working paper and not in the AER published paper, by the way. So I think that yours is significantly simpler, and it does not do yours justice to mention it so much as an inspiration at the beginning.
That's good. Can I put you down as a referee for the future?
Federico, you had a question.
Yeah. Hi, Stefan. So thanks a lot. It's a very cool paper. My question was if you could elaborate a little bit about the kind of no assimilation result that I think I saw in the slide, and I would like to understand something about the intuition, if possible. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. So very good. So what happened in the game is that, except for knife edge parameters value, the unique equilibrium will be fully separated from the start. The reason is, from the worker side, is quite easy to see it. From the worker side, it happened that, like, if one worker wants to work with a minority firm, all workers, because they all have the same wage, will be willing to do so, and therefore the equilibrium will unravel. So it has to be that from the workers, this disappears. From the firm perspective, the problem is that in the steady state, the proportions of type has to be similar, but like if the majority firms start to hire minority workers, the pool of minority workers is going to decrease over time, because there's never re-entry into the minority workers, and therefore it will go down all the way to zero. So that means kind of like a collapse in some sense of the model, because the minority group disappear over time. Now, one thing I would like to do is to fix theta, and then have the four groups with super productive minority and majority that will work with anyone, and that's the globalist. Less productive workers that will work kind of like only with the national, like group firms, and that's more the national. That will be my intuition for this equilibrium, and I can tell you this is a conjecture. I'd love to prove this is the case, but maybe in 2 or 3 years when I have time to solve this.
There was a question from Arda, who has to go in a second, so let me just read from the chat. Can you tell us why this result would fail to hold when the productivity is observable to both parties at the beginning of the relationship?
Sorry, I was very unclear. I apologize. This is I went too fast. I'm so sorry. No, the productivity is observed at the beginning of the relationship. So before they decide whether or not to enter in a relationship, they do observe theta. So they know exactly what will be the productivity of the worker they hire, the employers. So there is absolutely so this was unclear, and I think my conjecture is the result will hold if theta is not observed as well. I think it will be even easier to prove, in my opinion.
Okay, we have a time for one more questions before the official finish. Is there anyone who would like to give a comment or ask a question?
Can I ask a question?
Go
Yes.
ahead.
Or make a comment. So look, I haven't had much time to think about it, but I do have a question as to whether what you're doing, I mean, in a way, what is taste-based discrimination in some way, right? Fundamentally, if it's not based on productivity, it's gotta be something that's similar to what you described. So I'm trying to think as to whether you're actually, in a way, providing sort of going back one level in terms of micro foundations for taste-based discrimination. Because one of the things that for example, one of the things that I think about when I think of statistical discrimination is that it comes from the firms, in a way. What you seem to have, and correct me if I'm wrong, it seems to be crucial, is that the workers also discriminate, right? So, and that seems to be quintessentially taste-based in some way, right? So this idea that, if you taste-based discriminate, then productivity will go down. Well, it's true, but if it only comes from the firms. If there is taste-based discrimination, and taste-based discrimination is also on the workers' side, then it's not obvious that firms that will discriminate will be less productive, for example, right? So I'm wondering whether it's actually true that one, what you're doing predicts differently from taste-based if you allow discrimination, if you allow this on both sides, and two, whether that matters in a way, because maybe you're actually talking about the same thing.
So in some sense, I agree that the way the norms are working is related to the way people have thought about taste-based discrimination. I'm a bit worried into saying, claiming we endogenize it, because my understanding was that, but maybe I'm wrong, but my understanding was that, sorry about this, this is very bad. Taste-based discrimination would be here in your utility function, you will have a negative cost if you interact with a minority. That's usually the way. It's really an individual, it's more a notion of prejudice. And Alport tells us that while discrimination is a social phenomenon, prejudice is an individual phenomenon. It's based on the individual not liking to interact with member of the minority. Okay, so I mean in some sense I don't want to hang my hat on telling you no way I'm not.
No. So Stephane,
it would be better for me if I would be able to do it. I would tell you why I'm a bit worried of doing it.
No, but I think perhaps you should. I don't know it sounds like this is something that comes from referees and so on. So I don't know exactly what they told you and what you're planning to tell them, but I would be careful here because you might be overdoing it. I mean, to me, discrimination is a social phenomenon, full stop. It cannot be individual, right? In the sense, if I dislike people who are, between 175 and 180 centimeters tall, I'm kind of, people are looking at me and say, why, you see what I mean? It's not, I can pick any characteristic of anybody. So my feeling is that actually it would be profitable to think about how far, yes, you don't have these utilities in the utility functions, but that's why we call this maybe an endogenization of that, right?
This is a good moment to stop the official part of the seminar. We are at the top of the hour, so thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Stephane, for a great presentation.
Thank you very much for everyone.
But of course, everyone is welcome to stay. It seems like the discussion is heating up, and I'm sure it's going to be very interesting. Okay, so Stephane, go on.
No.